everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Monday, the 5th of October, where we are talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Last class I mentioned Poe briefly, and we also talked a little bit about some of the conventions for writing academic papers. And at this point, I believe I've returned all of the journals that would have been submitted to me on time for journal number 1 for Frankenstein. So if it turns out that you haven't received your journal, please let me know. And I am slowly working my way through those journals that were not submitted in on time, but I granted extensions to. So in terms of where we are, on Wednesday of this week, what we will be doing is beginning Jekyll and Hyde. So I'd encourage you to begin reading that text as soon as you can, even though we will be spending several classes devoted to Jekyll and Hyde. And much like with Frankenstein, I also wanted to talk about film in relation to Jekyll and Hyde. And this upcoming Wednesday should also be when you've got your second journal due on Edgar Allan Poe, which I'm going to be talking about today. And again, if you need an extension, you can ask me. But one of the reasons why I thought it would be better for you to get that journal in on Wednesday is because Monday's class on the 12th is Native Indigenous Day. In other words, we are not having classes. I won't be posting a video, and I will be reminding you of that next class. So you won't have any obligations, at least for my course, on that particular day. So I thought it would be better if you hand in your journal prior to that rather than after that. But again, if you need an extension, just let me know and I'll be happy to accommodate you. So we have 4 short stories, the first being The Fall of the House of Usher. That probably is the most challenging of all of the stories, and it also is the longest of the short stories that I assigned. And some of the points that I wanted to make about The Fall of the House of Usher is that the house represents not only the physical structure, but also the family of Usher. We oftentimes talk about the house of to illustrate family lineage. And when we talk about fall, obviously a fall is a descent, which is what we are going to see in this particular story. Fall is also a pun on autumn, which is when the setting of this story takes place. Very appropriate for the Gothic tradition, since fall represents descent, and also days such as Halloween occur in the fall. And Poe is a very poetic writer, even though we're focusing on his short stories, probably best known for his poem, The Raven. But we can see plenty of his poetic devices right from the very beginning of this story. For instance, some of the alliteration or the initial repetition of consonant sounds when he talks about a dull, dark day. So all of those D's in there. We definitely get a setting of isolation, which is very Gothic, and as we've already seen in the few readings that we've done with the Gothic, that isolation is a bad thing. The narrator is riding alone on horseback. The Usher house is basically isolated, and Roderick Usher himself is isolated, his sole companion being his sister, which we find out more about as the story progresses. Note that the narrator is in the first person I, which means that there's a certain level of subjectivity in relation to our hearing about this particular story. And when the narrator comes upon the house, we get personification, giving human-like characteristics associated to inanimate objects. In fact, the house is described as having eye-like windows. Poe oftentimes uses eyes in his stories. We'll see this again in some of the short stories that I had assigned for us. The idea that the eye can see the truth. And in fact, on page 22, if you're using the text, which I had assigned, it talks a little bit about the sentience of all vegetable things, that all inanimate objects have a certain level of life associated with them. Drug references, we know that Poe struggled with both drugs and with alcohol, and these are topics that we will oftentimes see in his writing. He makes references to opium in this particular piece, and also the idea of how it can help to drop the veil. In other words, that we can see the truth, and that's exactly what we're going to see about the Usher family. And when we think about the ushers, we've got a brother, a sister, and a house. In other words, three, which can represent Trinity in Christian tradition. And definitely there is this idea of Christian morality that's in Poe's works, even though Lovecraft, if you'll remember, in terms of Poe, talked about how Poe was a detached chronicler. But you can't help but see in the four stories, at least, that I chose for us to examine, that there is this moral lesson in all of these pieces. The Usher family is basically subject to evil, a generational family evil. It's never directly stated outright, but the assumption is incest. And some of the descriptions about some of the consequences of that, the unnatural sensations, the acuteness of senses, and there's a long tradition about the idea of inbreeding that can occur with incest and some of the physical ailments, not to mention some of the psychological ailments associated with incest. And both of those are illustrated within The Fall of the House of Usher, as we're told that basically Roderick and his sister Madeline are the last of their line, that there are no others. And this is a diseased family in a diseased house. In terms of mental disorders, Poe actually uses the word hypochondria in this story. Poe is a master of psychology, as Lovecraft had talked about. And hypochondria, in addition to this acuteness of senses, which helps to bring Roderick to madness, though one could say that he already is involved in a family filled with incestual madness. The atmosphere is very Gothic. So we've got descriptions of Gothic architecture of the house, decayed trees, fungi, all of that setting the stage for what's happening with the family. The description of Roderick, that he has a cadaverousness of complexion, reminds me so much of Frankenstein's creature, and the description of Frankenstein's creature, right down to the luminous eye and the silky hair. You know, this idea of that Roderick is alive, but yet in many ways is dead. And the same with his sister, though she will literally, Madeline, be deceased, dead, because she is diseased. She has illness and ailment to her. She happens to be his twin sister, and we've talked about the idea of doubling in Gothic and the idea of doppelganger. We see this with Walton and Victor in Frankenstein. We can see this with Victor and the creature in Frankenstein, and definitely we see this with Roderick and Madeline in The Fall of the House of Usher. To continue on some of Poe's poetic elements, he actually has what appears to be a poem entitled The Haunted Palace on page 21. And a quote from that is, "But evil things in robes of sorrow assail the monarch's high estate," which is a good amount of foreshadowing here about that the House of Usher was one probably of status and privilege. We'll revisit this idea when we talk about Prince Prospero in The Mass of the Red Death. But again, through their sin, they will experience descent. We know that Poe was obsessed with the idea of being buried alive, and premature burial oftentimes appears in his texts, which we see here with Madeline, who's put in the family vault. It would not have been that unusual for families of wealth and status to have their own burial areas. And then there is this long-winded excuse about how it's just more convenient to leave her there than to go to a public burial ground and have to answer questions, which makes us question exactly what is happening in the house and what exactly has happened to Madeline. And then by the ending, what we see is the literal as well as the figurative disintegration of the house and the family lineage, where it turns out that Madeline comes back and basically takes Roderick, her brother, with her. In other words, you can never bury and hide sin, which is a message that we will see in other of Poe's works as well. And then that ambiguous ending where it could possibly be supernatural if it is indeed the fact that this house has disintegrated into nothingness. Or it could, of course, be symbolic or metaphoric. And we'll see that ambiguous ending in all of the 4 texts that I have selected from Poe. Obviously, there are many more short stories. Some of them are very much in the vein of the detective story. But even The House of Usher mentions that there is a mystery that needs to be solved. And there is a close connection between the mystery and the idea of the Gothic. When we get to the Mask of Red Death, and several of you had indicated in your attendance question that that happened to be one of your favorite stories, if for no other reason, some of the modern day parallels that we're facing with disease and pandemic in our own society, and some of the morals and messages embedded within this text. We're introduced to the Red Death, which is supposed to be some kind of disease or plague that's ravaging the community. And if you know anything about plague, there's a long history when we've had times of plague. In fact, during Shakespeare's time, the theater houses were oftentimes closed for months at a time because of the Black Plague. But at any rate, this plague is associated with red or blood, and blood oftentimes represents life, as certainly in the idea of the Christian tradition, which we will talk about when we get to Dracula. There also are some theories about what is horrific, and that oftentimes that which is supposed to be interior, bodily fluids, for instance, that are made exterior, are part of what inspires horror, or if nothing else, as Stephen King would call it, the quote, gross out factor, unquote. Though Poe isn't very detailed in his descriptions, so there is this sense of the macabre, but probably it's a more appropriate approach for younger audiences, since many of you indicated that you had experience with Poe in high school and even in junior high school, and I myself did as well. He oftentimes, as I believe I mentioned in my previous video, happens to be a student favorite and a teacher favorite at that level. He just delves enough into the forbidden so that students have an interest, and his works are just long enough to keep a student's interest. That said, we're introduced to, in The Mask of Red Death, Prince Prospero. And you can probably tell from the word Prospero that there's supposed to be a connection with Prosperous, which Prince Prospero would be, because first he's a prince, so he has a certain level of status. And he also has a certain level of wealth and privilege, which comes with his status. And despite the fact that the community around him is suffering, he's happy and dauntless. That happens to be a quote. Might I suggest that he also suffers from excessive pride. And if you think about the possible alliteration of P for prince, P for Prospero, and P for proud or prideful, I think you can see where Poe is going with this particular story. Once again, we get the sense of isolation in that Prince Prospero's decided to go into deep seclusion along with some of his favorite friends and acquaintances to escape the plague. And not only do they hide from reality, but they also taunt reality by having a masquerade ball. The idea that they're going to have a celebration during this time of despair. And even the idea of a masquerade. And basically that's just a mask that hides the truth. And what this story is going to show us is the truth, that none of us can escape death, regardless of our position, regardless of our status, regardless of anything, really. And when we get the atmosphere of where they happen to be hiding, lots of Gothic architecture references and Gothic furnishing references. And as several of you pointed out, the reference to the 7 rooms. And while there certainly is color imagery associated with the rooms, I want to suggest that there also is numerical imagery. 7 works so nicely on a whole host of levels. There are the 7 deadly sins, which happen to be sloth, lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, envy, pride. And might I suggest that Prospero and the other revelers are guilty of all of these sins. Sloth, since they're spending their time basically eating and drinking. Lust, and one assumes that there also is fornication going on. Gluttony, again, the excess of food and drink, and perhaps sexuality. Greed, this idea that they want to live forever, or at least to escape the plight that others are experiencing. Envy, one might suggest that they are envious of those individuals who are not sick. Even something like wrath and the idea of their anger, that they too can be human and subject to mortality. And finally, the biggest one of all, pride, in thinking that they can escape death. And the one who is most guilty of this particular sin is Prospero, because he basically creates this situation where they can all try to hide. And also, as a leader, he negates his responsibility to the populace as they are suffering. And again, many of you indicated that you noted some modern day parallels with that. Might I say that you can also think of 7 in terms of the 7 stages of life, and the idea of infant, child, teen, young adult, adult, retirement, and elderly. If one were to make it through all 7 stages, well, the last stage is death, which is what these party goers are going to be encountering. 7 is oftentimes associated as a lucky number, lucky 7. I can say that these revelers will be anything but lucky in their attempt to escape the Red Death. The colors, blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, black. Perhaps you can make associations with those colors representing one of the different stages of life, or those colors representing some of the different 7 deadly sins. If nothing else, it wouldn't have all been unusual for a very large house to have so many rooms that those rooms would be given names. And oftentimes those names were based on the color scheme of the room, which is something that we will see in The Haunting by Shirley Jackson when we read that particular text. The ebony clock that's continually chiming. Ebony being a dark color, black, and the clock representing time. In other words, that time is the enemy, and that eventually all of their time will be up, which is exactly what we see. As we are left with midnight, which could be seen as the ending of their lives, or perhaps the beginning of the afterlife. And there are all kinds of occult and supernatural associations with midnight as well. Note how we see additional personification by Poe, oftentimes by capitalizing words we wouldn't expect to be capitalized, such as darkness and decay. And his fondness for alliteration. Not only are darkness and decay both words that start with the letter D, but immediately after that is the word dominion that also starts with D. And then we end up with the ambiguous ending, where this mysterious masked figure unmasks, and it happens to be the Death, which you can see as a literal representation of the Grim Reaper coming to collect. Or you can, again, and that would be the supernatural possibility, or you can see that more as a symbolic commentary, and that all of us have to eventually face death. And that said, if you know anything about Stephen King's The Shining and his episode with the masquerade ball, where they say unmask, unmask, that's a direct reference to Poe's Red Death, and or the Mask of Red Death. King being very well versed in the Gothic writers of his time, in a little way that he could pay homage perhaps to Poe. And we see in the Mask of Red Death, just like we saw in the previous piece, that there is a moral. In the Fall of the House of Usher, there are consequences to be paid for generational evil, incest. In the Mask of Red Death, there are consequences to be paid when the suffering of others are ignored, even flaunted. And the idea that one cannot escape death no matter how hard one tries. And there will be consequences for that. We saw that with poor Victor, didn't we, in Frankenstein. As we go to the Telltale Heart and also the Black Cat, we see this eye narrator who's incredibly unstable. The eye narrator is always problematic because there's a certain level of subjectivity in there. I don't know how much we can or cannot trust the eye narrator in The Fall of the House of Usher. But it's pretty clear in the Telltale Heart that we've got an insane narrator. And every reference to the sanity of the narrator just is an additional piece of evidence of the insanity of the narrator. Notice that the first word in the story is true, and that is one of the questions, is what is truth, and that ultimately the truth will ultimately be revealed. more references to eyes, and we see how eyes basically see the truth. The eye is what haunts this particular narrator. There are also references to eye in terms of things like evil eye, not that Poe directly referenced evil eye, but the idea of eye can lead to associations of evil eye, which is a look or a thought that's capable of inflicting injury. And obviously, this narrator does inflict injury upon his prey. And he talks about how the old man has this vulture eye. Notice that a vulture is a bird of prey. Again, it's midnight, helpful to our atmosphere here. D for death is capitalized, so we get some more personification. And then that element of the macabre that we've become accustomed to in Poe, in this instance, is the dismembered corpse that he's so easily able to dismember. Again, that's just further evidence of his insanity. And the retribution that he will experience when the police, who represent moral authorities, come by. And of course, we see this narrator's incredible hubris and arrogance, much like we saw hubris and arrogance in The Mask of Red Death, where basically he's taunting the police about his innocence. And of course, that's what leads to the uncovering of his guilt with that beating heart that he hears. That could be a supernatural ending if there really is a beating heart, or if this is just a figment of his imagination, specifically of his guilt, and that's more of a psychological explanation. I would say that I like embracing both myself when I read some of these Poe stories. And the idea of what a heart represents, specifically a beating heart, that's life. And of course, he's stolen that from his victim. And also the beating heart, which represents fear. When we go to the Black Cat, and that's the fourth story, and it's very similar to the Telltale Heart, and this is a heart that does tell the tale of the truth, ultimately. It helps to expose the evils, the murder of the narrator. The Black Cats come with certain associations with them. They are oftentimes associated with evil in superstitious stories, also witches' familiars. However, they're seen in a more positive way in some of Egyptian mythology. They're seen as sacred. Both of these meanings work well in terms of this particular short story, with once again an I narrator who is an alcoholic. And we can discuss whether or not the insanity came before the alcoholism, hence the alcoholism, or if the insanity came after the alcoholism, a result of alcoholism. But basically, we get this narrator confessing to us before he's going to be executed. One assumes that we're getting the truth of the tale, because what does he have to lose at this point? And if he's going to be executed, one assumes it's through the gallows, which would be very appropriate, I think, considering the fact that he executes the first cat through hanging. We're told about the evil, which happens to be intemperance, which is alcoholism. Again, not too surprising that Poe is talking about the evils of drugs and alcohol, something that we'll also talk about with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde when we get to that particular text. And this evil, intemperance, leads to a loss of reason, meaningless violence, and self-destruction, which we can see within this particular character. And we're told that prior to drinking, he was the gentlest soul. You can make a determination for yourself whether or not we believe him or whether or not that's an excuse. But nevertheless, we learn about his cat Pluto. Pluto is a very deliberately chosen name that happens to be the Roman god of the underworld, or the Lord of Death. And Poe oftentimes likes to use language that is going to bring forth these sorts of associations. We learn about how ultimately he's so infuriated by this cat at one point that he has to pluck out its eye. And the idea of the eye, and you can see the truth with one's eye. Again, this repetition of eye over and over again. And perhaps the cat can see the truth of him in terms of his drunken state, and perhaps even in his sober state. Perhaps he isn't quite as kind as he says he was prior to his drunkenness. At any rate, he does mention something on page 110, which I think is quite telling, and how oftentimes we are all attracted to the forbidden, that we commit a vile action specifically because we should not. And that's something to consider in the Gothic text that we're reading, one wonders if Victor was perhaps propelled by trying to create life from death simply because he knew he shouldn't have done such a thing. And we can revisit this in other ways as well. But nevertheless, with this narrator, eventually we learn of a fire after he has hung the cat. And the idea of hellfire, which would be the result of his sins, is definitely embedded within the idea of the literal fire that he experiences, as well as this long convoluted explanation of his seeing the image of the roped cat that he's hung, that somehow it must have been thrown into his room during the fire and it's left an image. Again, the idea that he's being haunted by the cat or being haunted by his sins. What's very interesting about this particular piece, as some of you alluded to, is that you found this piece to be more visceral than some of the others because of the sympathy and empathy you have for the cat. And I can say that I feel much the same, in that I can oftentimes read about murder of a human being, much like I did with the Telltale Heart, and it doesn't have the same kind of emotional gravitas and impact on me as it would with an animal. Idea that an animal is seemingly innocent, and we know how oftentimes movies will manipulate our emotions by showing things like animals, also babies. That's the old joke for actors: never work with an animal or a baby because they'll steal the show. And that an animal is likely to evoke a much more horrified reaction from an audience member, an animal that is experiencing abuse or death, than perhaps another human being. But at any rate, eventually we see how this narrator gets a second cat. Again, this idea of doubling and doppelganger, who happens to be eyeless. This cat does have a white splotch, but it looks identical to the first cat. Perhaps the white could be representative of truth, and that this cat will help to reveal the truth of the evils of this narrator. And in his attempt to axe this cat, he ends up axing his wife. And again, most people, when they talk about the story, they focus less on the dead wife and more on the dead cat. But nevertheless, he decides to bury her in the cellar wall. Again, sort of reinforcing this idea of being buried alive that Poe was fearful of, but also the idea that you can never bury your secrets. They will always be exposed in one way or another. The skeletons will come out of the closet, or in this instance, the cellar wall, if you will. Once again, the police come by as representational of moral authority, and we find out that there's been a premature burial of this cat. The ambiguous ending, supernatural. The idea is, was this cat buried alive, or is this some sort of spirit of the cat? Perhaps the first cat that's coming to haunt our narrator, and basically the guilt of the narrator could be the psychological explanation, but the guilt of the narrator could also be the supernatural explanation, in that there is justice to be served. So you can see how many of these stories, even though we've read only 4, have similarities embedded in them, because Poe oftentimes revisited many of the same themes and ideas. And that what we've got as a short story is the telling usually of a particular incident, rather than talking about something that's much more long-winded, which is what we saw with Frankenstein, with multiple episodes associated with them. And then when we move forward to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, what we're going to get is an in-between genre called novella, which means that it's longer than the short story. It'll have more than one episode. But that said, it doesn't have the depth or the complexity that we might experience in a novel, such as Frankenstein. What you will also see, I believe, is that the language should be becoming a little bit more accessible as we continue on, especially once we finish up with Dracula and we get into more contemporary texts. But that said, we are still working with texts from the 1800s, and knowing a little bit about the time period of the 1800s can be very useful for us understanding texts such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Victorian period, and how that influenced Robert Louis Stevenson in his writing, as well as Bram Stoker in his writing. So that's what we're going to be talking about next class. So in terms of today's attendance question, since the last attendance question asked you to discuss which story you like the best, I thought today's attendance question could ask you, which story did you like the least? And the reasoning why. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. Now, in terms of your journal for Poe, since Poe is a series of short stories, there are a couple different ways you can approach it. With your journal with Frankenstein, you were writing on one text, Frankenstein, but you were able to decide what to focus on within that particular text. In terms of Poe, you can decide to focus on all 4 short stories and talk briefly about all 4. Or you can focus on one short story and talk more in depth about it. Or you can take some middle ground, talking about 2 or just 3. So you have a lot of latitude as to how you approach Poe. But the idea behind the journal with Poe is that it would be similar to what you did with the Journal of Frankenstein. That it would just be thoughts and observations and perhaps questions that you would have in terms of Edgar Allan Poe. Again, I'm not necessarily doing Poe in terms of a particular piece of writing. I'm studying, or I'm exposing us to Poe in terms of him as a writer, with 4 pieces that you can decide to examine all or part of in terms of your analysis for your journal. So I hope you're all well. I am well. And next class, we'll finish up with some odds and ends with Poe, and we will talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Take care. Bye-bye.